3 seconds. So we've got rail on board.
Right, so we're returning to Marcus, aren't we?
We're live.
Thank you. Good afternoon. We'll reconvene, and we now have Louise Taylor on board to respond to questions. So thank you, Louise, for making yourself available today. We have been through your evidence, and most of the points in it are clear and to the point. And there's just a couple of things that I wanted to ask about, and rather than do the usual intro, given that we I understand most of what's there, I thought I'd just go straight to the questions. And at paragraph 4.1 of your evidence, you make reference to the emissions reduction plan and action 10.3 in it, 10.3.1, which talks about supporting the decarbonisation of freight. Of course, that plan was prepared by the previous government. Are you able to tell us anything more since then?
Good afternoon, councillors and commissioners. Thanks for the opportunity. With me today, I have Michelle Grimlington-Hancock from KiwiRail, and Michelle might be able to talk to that. I'm not able to answer your question directly, Commissioner.
Sorry, sir, I'm not able to either, but I'm happy to go away and find the answer for you.
I can help you out because in 2024, an updated plan was issued by the government. So that's an updated emissions reduction plan, and that no longer contains any provision in it relating to the decarbonisation of freight. So the discussion that takes place in Louise's evidence, I think, is no longer applicable.
Thank you, sir. I'll accept that as I'm sure you've checked that. I'm happy to delete paragraph 4.3 from my evidence.
Thank you. Now the second matter is at paragraph 5.4, and you were discussing there about doing work outside of the rail designation and issues with the bridge pier. Of course, the bridge itself and the piers are in the riverbed. So the bed of the river, the district plan isn't able to have any rules relating to it. It's an Environment Southland issue. So I just wanted to highlight that while there may be areas outside of the designation on the approaches, the examples you've given relating to the bridge piers themselves isn't a matter we're able to have regard to.
Yeah, that's correct in the sense that any works within the river will be managed by the region, and I think I covered that in the last time we met. But there is likely to be work required on land adjacent to the river that would be controlled by the district. So you're quite right that, and probably the majority of the consenting issues would be for the region to consider in that context. But I've been advised by KiwiRail that it is likely they would have to do works outside their designation on land as part of their that project.
And accepting of that. Had you given any thought to the process, what used to be section 123, not too sure where it is now, of an alteration to a designation and the fact that they can be done on a non-notified basis?
Well, that's not something that I've discussed with KiwiRail. I don't know if, Michelle, you want to jump in there, whether you look at altering your designation to extend that area of land?
It's not something that we've thought about to date, but it's definitely something that we could take into consideration, because that would give us long-term protection for any rock revetment or anything that we needed to do adjacent to bridge abutments.
Exactly, yes. All right, so they're really just the three brief things that I had, and I don't think any other commissioner had any other questions to put to you. I'll just check. No. So thank you for making yourselves available today, and we'll move on. So thank you very much.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Okay, so we're waiting for Tonkin and Taylor to come up on board, and they're there? Yeah. Okay, so we can deal with them now. Let's just find the evidence. Plans. Lots of pieces of paper. The reason why I was having difficulty finding it, it's in a document called Appendix C that has a number of bits of expert evidence in it. So we've got a report here from Tonkin and Taylor, and who is it we've got online?
Tim Morris.
Oh, Tim, yes, of course. Yeah. So Tim, if you just give us a brief overview of what's in your report. And then we've got a number of questions to put to you that are in part relevant in the way that we've been recommended to deal with the integration of the information that you've given us with the information that's come from Environment Southland, is what Environment Southland are promoting. So please, a brief overview first, and then we'll go to some questions.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. Core District Council engaged Tonkin and Taylor just to provide some assistance and expert advice on flooding matters for the plan. So first we looked at settlement zones and then the natural hazard zones as well. I guess it was a bit difficult when we first got involved. There was quite limited information on the extent of flooding and the flood hazard arising from that in terms of depth velocity. Since then we've been provided with some information from Environment Southland and for Gore and Mataura, and that information is of a high standard and appropriate. And I agree with the comments made this morning by Matt Gardner. I guess what I will say is that our engagement didn't include preparation of a model, and I guess because of the limited information, we relied to an extent on a model that we prepared for other purposes. It's relatively high level, has a number of assumptions, quite a little bit simplistic compared to the work Environment Southland used. So I guess we used that information, that model, when taken together with other information, including historic reports and observations on flooding, other information on flooding, other models, just to help inform our conclusion. So I guess the two models are quite different, and they shouldn't be kind of confused as providing the same level of information.
The work that was initially done by Tonkin and Taylor was done at a national level, I think was the response. And at what scale was that done? Can you comment on that?
Yeah, so I guess we work with private and council organisations right across the country. So this model was prepared to cover the whole country, and because it covers such a wide area, It's quite coarse and has a number of simplifications. For example, the topographical data that looks at kind of bigger areas doesn't look at the detail, and so it wouldn't necessarily provide a good level of detail along the stop bank crest, for example. And it's important that for these sorts of models, stop bank crests are accurately represented in a model. We've relied on published information on ground cover, and that informs things like the hydraulic roughness or how the speed the water will flow over the land. And we haven't checked or benchmarked that. So uncertainties in these sort of things will impact on the results. And look, I'm not trying to cast doubt on our work. Our work it's good work. It's just that the model wasn't prepared to inform the plan. And there's a lot of this mapping will have a lot of significance if it's added into the plan. It will impact on people's lives and businesses. And I guess that our model isn't fit for that purpose. But it does give. But what it does do is, when taken together with the Environment Southland modelling outside of Mataura and Gore, the older modelling, the historic information, if you take all that information together, it does help form a view on what the likely extent of flooding in a particular event will be.
And the work that was done on the various maps that show up is an indicative 1% AEP flood hazard.
Yes. Yes.
What year was it done, and is the 1% hazard then still the 1% hazard now?
You're talking about when was our model? Our model was
Yes.
prepared last year, and it was based on hydrological or rainfall information that was current as of last year.
Okay, and as a result of the Environment Southland work, you've recommended some changes to previous recommendations, particularly in the industrial zoning, the industrial area in the development plan for South Gore, where previously it had been recommended to have a no-build area. What's in the supplementary evidence is now a recommendation that no-build restriction can be uplifted. Am I interpreting that correctly?
So you're referring to my recent evidence?
Yes.
So which paragraph?
I don't have the paragraph number in front of me. Let's see if I can bring it up. I'll come back to it. Cliff, have you got any questions?
No,
Glenys, Maria?
I've got a broad question in terms of, I think we do understand quite well and have received what you're saying around the limitations of your model and what it's designed to do and what it's not designed to do. So what I heard from you and what I heard from Ms. Patterson earlier as well was this is good information when you put it together with the historical inundation information, for instance. And I'm particularly thinking about the areas outside of those areas that ES have done the finer grained modelling for. Because we've now obviously got finer grained modelling for Gore and Mataura, but outside those areas we've just got the notified plan maps and supporting information from the Tonkin and Taylor model. So would you agree that where we've got the higher resolution information from ES, we should be utilising that in preference, but outside of those areas we could look to the Tonkin and Taylor modelling in conjunction with the work that Gore District Council did on historic inundation?
I think I agree with Matt Gardner that the model that he's prepared is, because there's been so much more effort devoted to it, that's much more accurate in areas where they overlap. And I'd be very happy for the Tonkin and Taylor model to be used, but for it to be suitable for that purpose, it would require refinement, calibration against existing floods to check that the model's giving similar inundation to specific recorded events, that the topography is accurate and is sufficiently accurate, that stop bank reefs are accurately presented, matters of that nature. So subject to those refinements, then I would agree with that, but not for the model to be used in its current state, just because of the consequences on people's lives and businesses and that.
So where we look outside of the Gore and Matara areas that are subject to the ES modelling, we only have the notified PDP maps, which are based on the historical inundation and that work from Gore, and what TNT have provided. That's all we have to guide us to think about the difference between significant inundation and lower risk. So would you agree that that would constitute our best available information in those areas outside of the Gore and Mataura areas?
Well, yeah, I mean, I would agree that that is current information, but I guess what I would challenge is the consequences of your decisions and making sure that the information that you're relying on is fit for that purpose. So I guess there's a question there, I guess.
My question back to you, and it's quite an important one, is how should we, as decision makers, make use of the Tonkin and Taylor evidence?
Well, so the Tonkin and Taylor, the outcome of that model, the results of that model will provide a general perspective on relative flood risk, and it will clearly highlight areas that are more likely to flood or less likely to flood. I guess I won't repeat what I've said before in terms of absolutely relying on it, given the we weren't necessarily engaged to prepare a model. It's just something we had available that helped inform our opinion, and it is, if it was to be incorporated in a plan, it possibly could be open to challenge or matters of that nature.
And that might be, for instance, how it's incorporated. So, for instance, if we know that it has these limitations, it's quite coarse, but it is, a general flag, that it might be a general flag for additional work to be done if you want to build in an area that shows a likelihood of more significant flood risk.
Well, I'll just give the general perspective, and I guess I'd just bear in mind that we haven't assessed the point, the 200-year event as well. So that's been considered. Again, I don't think the Met Gardner hasn't considered that scenario either. So that's just, I guess, it's just a question as well. But certainly, it does provide a good perspective on the relative likelihood of flooding.
If I go to figure 10 in your report, which is on page unnumbered, what figure 10 shows, page 20 of the PDF that we've got, which is Appendix C, which includes other material as well. But I think your report was first, so it's likely on page 20. Are you with me on that one?
Sorry, which is the date on that one? The date of that report, please.
11th of June 2024.
Yes, yep.
Right, so what that shows is an area in blue which shows flood depths of greater than 100 millimetres, and it also shows a red line which is headed up Southland Flood Protection Network, which actually is the extent of the land shown in the district plan, is being susceptible to flooding. So there's very little difference in terms of what is currently in the plan to what shows up on your figure, and I suspect that given that you've based it on existing data as well, that's why I'd expect to see a correlation. Yeah, it just extends in a number of places a small distance out. In other cases, it actually follows the red line, which is really the line out of the operative district plan. Really, in answer to the question of how far out from the existing mapped area does your work go, and the answer is not a lot by the look of it. Is that a fair comment?
Yeah, well, I mean, in that case, it does line up pretty well. Some other areas it does differ a little bit.
Because what it shows to me is that it actually adds to the value of the data, that is extent of data that's shown in the plan and as notified, saying that it's there or thereabouts.
Yeah. I mean, I guess that when we were asked to comment on the extent of those areas, there wasn't much available to substantiate or to evidence the area that had been defined. So we looked at this kind of rough model, and the two seemed to line up kind of okay in most places, which kind of led us to conclude that that mapping was broadly okay. But I guess differentiating that there's a difference there between, I guess, relying on that mapping that we've prepared as Environment Southland had proposed, and I guess I kind of I disagree with that statement quite strongly, and don't think that that's a fair proposal given the nature of this additional work and how we prepared it and what it was prepared for and matters of that nature.
Can I ask, you've noted that there were some differences between the notified plan and your model outputs. Can you highlight for us, it's probably in a report somewhere, but if you could highlight for us again what those key differences are, that would be helpful.
Yeah, I guess we're just looking at one figure. Off the top of my head, I don't recall exactly some exact examples, but when we were putting it together, I guess there were a number of locations where there was some discrepancy.
Do you think it would?
I guess we could provide some further follow-up clarification on that point if that was of value to you.
I think it would be really helpful to understand what those differences are and where they are. Yeah. Because we've only got, outside of this Gore-Mataura area that's modelled by ES, we really only have the work that you've done and the notified planning maps. So anything that helps us understand how well they overlap and where they differ is helpful.
Yeah, no, we can look at that. Just some examples. Yep, that's no problem at all.
And I think it was in the supplementary evidence from Brett that talked about the earlier recommendation in industry. Are you able to help us there?
Within my 42A?
No, within your supplementary.
Okay, I'll have to tend to it.
Because you describe it in general terms and I can't quite find it. I guess what we'd be looking for is, for the avoidance of doubt, actually having a plan where there's any changes to previous recommendations.
The by reference issue?
No.
No?
No. So when we're dealing with the industrial development area in South Gore, there was a recommendation from Tonkin and Taylor that part of that area be excluded from having buildings because of depth of water that was on it.
Yes.
The work that Environment Southland has done
Yes.
shows that the depth of water is substantially less than what had shown up in the Tonkin and Taylor report, and therefore somewhere in the papers there's a recommendation that the no-build area can be uplifted.
Yes. That's in evidence, that's in advice from Tonkin and Taylor. There's 7 pieces of expert advice. I just need to point to the right data one.
Even if we come back to it tomorrow,
Should be able to find it.
because an amorphous description of you can change the zoning doesn't give me the certainty that in fact if we adopt that recommendation we're going to show it correctly on the maps.
Yes.
Yeah, we can look at that, and I guess if there's more accurate information that's become available since those conclusions were drawn, then happy to look at that and modify the conclusions to reflect that new information.
Okay, anything else to Tim? No. Okay, Tim, thank you for all that, and we may need to come back and just issue in writing where we need further information. So thank you for coming on board and making yourself available and being mucked around time-wise. That's appreciated.
Oh, sorry, no.
Yes,
There was one
wonderful.
more. I knew when you asked me that question there was a dull bell ringing. No, I did want to ask, and I asked it of Mr. Roy about, because he's suggesting that we visibly rely on the guidelines that Tonkin and Taylor and Matt Gardner and co have used. So you've used the same guidelines, just with different levels of input, I guess, data. Is there any reason not to lean on those and make them visible in the plan itself? i.e., are you anticipating that those guidelines are going to stand for a good long time in terms of the H1 to H6, those classifications and the basis of the work that you've both done?
Yes, no, that's good. A good reference to rely on. Absolutely, and I think, if I can, one sort of, I guess my experience is that the H4 and H5 areas, in most cases, it's not, I guess, financially viable to undertake the necessary mitigation measures so that area can be developed. Although my colleague is working on a significant subdivision in North Canterbury at the moment where they are raising the ground in what was formerly an H5 area so that it can be built on, but I guess that's the exception to the rule. But I guess don't think that H3 areas should necessarily be ruled out, and it's in many cases it's interventions can be made, for example raising the ground level so that H3 areas could be developed. So I think there was possibly a slight difference of opinion on the status of H3.
Right, so you'd have no trouble, and this is what I understood from your evidence or the Tonkin and Taylor evidence in prior hearing streams, that from H4 and above we are talking about significant risk in your mind, and then H3 you're putting in a different category of maybe, would I say moderate or moderate to high or something like that?
Yeah, there is, but I guess I'm just saying that interventions or engineering works could be undertaken to lower the risk in areas that were initially assessed as H3 without any engineering work. So yeah, it could be that this area at the moment it's assessed to be H3, but if we so it shouldn't necessarily be ruled out if the appropriate engineering work can be undertaken to manage the risk.
That conversation is slightly different to what is in your report, and I'm looking at what shows up on my copy as pages 21 and 22, where you're talking about areas adjacent to the river that are H3, H4, some development could be feasible, and it goes on the next page to describe areas H5 and H6, where you recommend that areas of higher hazard, being H5, H6, the zone boundaries are adjusted to avoid these areas.
I guess that's what I was just hoping to say, that you know, the H3 areas work can be undertaken, and beyond that it generally becomes doesn't really become economically viable or attractive to undertake engineering work on those areas.
Okay, thank you.
H4 and above, yeah.
Yeah, H4 and above, yes. Okay, so that's all I think we need from you, Tim. Thank you for making yourself available.
Okay, thank you.
And we will return to Environment Southland of questions for Marcus, unless there's anything you want to add in terms of a pretty picture.
Yeah, just want to, I guess, put the hearing panel clear. When I opened my mouth and said there's a 1% AEP risk profile for Gora Matara, apparently it was a 2% breach scenario,
Yep.
but due to the magic of a lunch break and some caffeine and some hard graft, Matt and Joe have actually prepared something for us. So I'll hand over to Joe. Oh, we can't hear you, Joe.
Sorry, apologies. Thank you for having us back. So Matt, if you can share screens of the 1% AEP of Gore and Matoda. These maps are appended in Appendix H. Is that correct, Matt? Yes, they are.
That's correct. So this is Appendix H. So Appendix H contains maps for both a 2%, these first maps are 2%, and then following that it has the hazard maps for, here we go, 1%. So that's Upper Gore, that's upstream of the township. And we move down.
Just to confirm, you can see this on the screen. I can see you looking like you can. Yeah, thank you.
It's a bit hard to fit all on the screen, so the legend is down here. Here's your legend just so that you get a view of that now. H1 is dark blue, H2 is the turquoisey, H3 is the green, H4 is the light green, H5 is yellow, and H6 is red. And the descriptions we always put up on the map somewhere away from the main area, but H1, generally safe for vehicles, people and buildings. H2, unsafe for small vehicles. H3, unsafe for vehicles, children and the elderly. H4, unsafe for vehicles and people. H5, unsafe for vehicles and people in all buildings, vulnerable to structural damage, some less robust buildings subject to failure. And H6, unsafe for vehicles and people, all building types considered vulnerable to failure.
So what page on the Land River Sea Consulting document is that you're looking at? It's a bit hard finding Appendix H.
I've supplied to Environment Southland the full document, and I'm aware from Joe that potentially what was uploaded to the website, it was cut into pieces, and I'm not sure, I haven't seen their exact link.
Yeah, I suspect that it's not actually there, so I apologise to the panel for misleading you and having the incorrect link up on the website. There's been an oversight between catchment planning and the comms team that have led to that. So effectively the scenarios you're seeing on the screen have not yet hit the website.
So can we have a copy of Appendix H? How many pages?
Appendix H I can send to Joe Patterson right now. I've actually PDF'd it as a separate PDF if that helps, Joe.
Yeah, and so we can send you a SharePoint link, as well as we're rectifying this on the website today, so it'll be accessible there as well.
So can you just...
It's going to have Matoda as well.
Yeah, so if we're just talking about Appendix H, can you please send that through to our hearings admin people? So hearings at goredc.govt.nz, just Appendix H.
Yeah.
That's of what is most interest, and if the admin support group can actually print off some copies of that, would be helpful, please, as soon as it arrives. because it comes back to the issue of the extent of what we're looking for, and really wanted to have the dialogue with you while we've got the plans in front of us.
Certainly.
And I think a lot of this is going to the key output differences, the differences between the notified plan map, the ES model output and the T&T model output. We need to actually know where the key points of difference are, like geographically really, like where the maps are telling us something different.
Yeah.
Because that helps us think about scope.
And I'll be looking forward to some feedback from our advisors in terms of the Southland District submission that talked about different levels of risk, and whether that doesn't actually open the door a little bit in terms of the argument that you're putting forward.
Yes, certainly, and I think to the hazard profiles on the maps outline the extent of the risk a lot more than the notified version of the plan, purely in the sense that the depth and flow or velocity of that water creates quite a high risk profile. So having a pure management regime in the protected area of the overlay, in my view, wouldn't accord with a void stance in the Southern Regional Policy Statement.
Except being clear that it's a void significant, so then it comes back to where our line is for significant, and we've got at the moment a couple of different views on where that line should land.
Correct, whether it's H3 or H4.
So I think what we can usefully do is continuing with our questions of Marcus, and while we're waiting for those plans to turn up, we can continue with looking at the Section 42A report. So are there any further questions to Marcus?
I believe I've asked all mine, but it's good having your Appendix 1 to think about when we're talking with Mr Osborne. Kia ora.
So I guess then that will take us back to the Section 42A report.
Where do we leave off? Where would you like me to start?
Well, it's where we'll start, I think.
Okay.
And I want to focus a little bit on the updated plan provisions.
Appendix
because
A.
I think that takes care of a big chunk of what's in your report. And probably, while I've got some issues over some of the wordings of the objectives and policies, I can come back to them. The issue I've got is as follows. As notified, there were a number of rules that dealt with buildings and other activities, and the rules stated excluding the stop-back protection area. The changes that you have made to the rules now includes the stop protection area, and the question I have is, would a reasonable person looking at the plan provisions, which are very specific in the rules, anticipate the rules now turning around 180 degrees, saying they are now included? The logic that's in your report, if I'm picking it up correctly, is saying I've made some changes to the policies, and to give effect to those we need to change the rules. But is that actually stretching the rubber band too far?
So I have addressed that alignment. So yes, there is a discussion back to the policy framework, because obviously the provisions and the rules, and particularly around NHR2, to give effect to those policies. But it does hang its hat on the submission from ES in terms of requesting further expansion of the rules, and in particular a concern raised by ES that the stop bank protection area did not have any provisions applying to it. So ES are seeking a new provision amongst their other amendments to address how hazards are being addressed in flood-prone areas. And that's addressed through whether it's protected or it's not protected. And the original submission from ES speaks a lot to that direction and that distinction of the RPS. That's now shifted since the ES model is surfaced in recent time, away from now the argument of protected versus protected, and in fact trying to convince me that the RPS is not centred around that. And I think that's where our points of differences are sitting. I've already acknowledged that the hazard rating categories are more useful, and in contemporary space, that's where we would be looking if we were starting fresh. The challenge is, how do you map that at this point in time? And how do you agree on those thresholds when you've got cobbled or together two different models of different course layers? Hopefully they integrate well enough to then separate those categories out and have your provisions speak to them. So I know that's a long-winded way of talking about it, but I guess what it is trying to demonstrate is that I haven't thought about this in a bubble. The approach to how the rule framework and the policy framework sit have been carefully considered, because you can't just tweak anything in isolation. Everything has an implication. I've tried to do it in a balanced way where we look at how are existing areas that are protected and how does that relate to the RPS, and then follow that higher order document direction down to the rule framework and replicate that through the policy framework.
Notwithstanding that you've probably given a very strong argument that supports the Environment Southland approach of wanting to change the maps, that we'll come back to.
And the RPS.
Yes. Taking a narrow view, I guess the question is, what submission are you relying on to do that?
The ES submission.
Yes, but which point of the ES submission?
I'll go dig it out. I'll have to read my...
Yeah, so if taking the narrow view, and some of the advice we get is that there needs to be a clear link between the submission and what the end point is. That the legal advice that we've got is that you've got what's notified at one end of the spectrum, you've got what a submitter says at the other end of the spectrum, and the outcome needs to be something in between. You can't go beyond what was there. So that's one issue. The second issue is, can you tell me how many sections are affected by that change in the rule? How many properties?
Not off the cuff, I'd have to...
So surely that's a Section 32 matter that needs to be assessed as part of the change.
Yes, it has, and we've had an economic analysis done at a broad layer through Natalie's evidence, and she would be able to speak to that a little bit better in terms of, say, the economic impacts on.
So what was in her evidence is that the cost of going through a resource consent is maybe 5% of the total cost of building a house, and therefore that's not significant. But from a planner's point of view, the mere fact that you've got to go through a consent, is that a disincentive that we should be taking into account?
It needs to be balanced. You need to take into account the risk that's been exposed and the cost of replacement of property as well.
When we were dealing with the residential submissions and chapter of the plan, we had a recommendation that we should be allowing secondary dwellings as a permitted activity throughout the residential zone. And it would appear that the implications of what's in your report should be that that rule should be taken out of areas subject to inundation and a consent required.
Which is that, sorry? Which rule?
So, the rules in the residential section allow a secondary dwelling as of right on sites in a residential zone. And while not covered in your report, the implication is that that right to build a second dwelling should not apply to certain areas subject to inundation.
Do you mean as a permitted activity
Yes.
that right would be changed if it
Yes.
was subject to a flood hazard?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
And also an implication of what you're saying is that any vacant property in the areas shown there requires a resource consent to build a house.
Which area are you referring to? The stop bank protection?
Or the purple area. So I'm talking about
Yes.
outside the flood banks.
Yes.
So is the standard residential zoning that we've provided for in the notified plan the appropriate residential zoning to have across that land?
That's kind of it's kind of indicating a discussion around managed retreat, because these are existing urban areas, and the discussion around the appropriateness of continuing to invest or extend within an urban area is part of that bigger approach in terms of should we actually be retreating from the hazard and completely.
All right.
And that's
so
a much bigger discussion.
from a natural justice point of view, do you believe it's appropriate to proceed with your recommendations of requiring a consent through what is probably about 40% of the residential zone of Gore and all of Mataura as part of this submission process, or doing it by way of a plan change?
I think the plan change would give you the opportunity to fine-tune it. What is being presented up until now, and it's shifting very quickly today, would be a non-complying activity. So it would be almost, it would be heavily constrained within Gore in comparison to the provisions that I've recommended for that area.
Okay, so when we dealt with the townships zones, what was recommended to us as part of the Section 42 reports for that was, in areas where development had already occurred, then further development should be allowed, notwithstanding potential for certain levels of flooding. In areas where development hadn't occurred, then the land should be rezoned. Are you supportive of that approach, or are you advocating that what we just described in Gore should also apply in other areas?
So you're referencing the settlement zone and the rural lifestyle zone, is that?
Just the settlement zone.
Like
Just the
Mandeville
settlement
and Pukeroa.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah, so
Pukeroa.
yes, and I have assessed that, and informing a view around that, I've taken advice from TNT in terms of what the risks are in that area, given that it is a coarser model, but there is still opportunity in those spaces.
And is it your professional planning view that we can do that without giving an opportunity to the submitters to the residential and townships provisions, without giving them an opportunity to comment?
Well, they have had an opportunity to comment through the PDP process, and certainly since my amendments are quite clear through the Appendix A that I've attached to my 42A report, there has been a process up to this point.
Yeah, although I'd say that the submitters on this chapter are not the same submitters we had to the residential and township zones. And I guess if we're going to go ahead and do it, I want to know that there's a strong basis that allows that to happen without actually going back to these submitters saying, look, there's been a significant change in the rules that have been recommended.
It's there is a clear rationale within there in terms of how we get there, and it is supported by expert evidence. I guess the contrast is taking the approach that ES is advocating, that it should just be avoided in any development in that space, and that's certainly a much higher level of discouragement for development or otherwise in there that would equally, would be a concern, but that has only literally just been introduced through evidence now.
I would find it helpful to have those maps back up on the screen, just because what I immediately found useful because of trying to tease out the significance line, it's just very useful to have those maps up on screen to think about where H3 and H4 are, you know, that kind of implication. And even if we look at the course work done by T&T in those settlement areas, it might help us there too, to think about, because the extent is different to these grades, and the grades provide us with potentially a finer way to respond to the risks. And that's been signalled both actually by Mr. Roy and Mr. Morris, in terms of H3 is probably the one where you've got options to respond, and it gets much harder once you hit H4 and above to respond. So that would seem to be quite a clear signal from the expert that, you know, as soon as we've hit H4, we're in territory where it should be harder to obtain consent or develop. But maybe we've got room to talk around H3, and that might look a little bit more like what was notified within the Stock Bank protection area, perhaps. That kind of idea. But it would be helpful to have the map back up actually of Appendix H, just to think about these things, understand that it doesn't have the settlement zones, but it's just to give us a sense of percentages, as Mr. Commissioner Havel was saying, you know, like if you take the full extent, you know, it's a pretty whopping great percentage of core, but once we start to be a bit more fine-tuned about it, we might be talking about different percentages of impact.
I also feel too that there'll be cost implications for making the area much larger for those people who live in those areas, with their costs of insurance and maybe their resale values on their properties. That would all have to be considered as well.
Yeah, no, I agree. And Natalie Hampson's evidence goes into some detail, just considering those implications, you know, both, you know, the pros and cons of it, but applying an economic, you know, approach or model to it. And she's definitely better placed to be able to answer that question.
Could we have Appendix H back up on screen? I quite like having it there.
It appears Joe's jumped off the call, but I'm just wondering whether the hearings administrators received that email yet.
Sorry, I was just going to make the same point as I think Marcus has, that yeah, Joe and Matt aren't on the call anymore, so hopefully the emails come through.
I've just, for the panel, I've just texted Jo as well to see if she can send that to me as well. It hasn't been received yet, so I'll work on it.
If I can do something completely different then and go to the bottom of page 6 on the updated, checked up, there's some words there, non-sensitive subject to zone provisions. Is that a leftover from your notes, or what's that meant to be doing?
Yes, it is, well spotted. Yeah, no, and it's inferring that we're outside, those provisions would prevail.
Yeah, and then across to page 7, and on the rule, looking at matters of discretion, number 5, one of the matters is matters of discretion of any infringed standard. That particular rule, Rule 4, does not refer to the standards, and I'm picking that should be deleted.
Yes, it may well be a hangover there. Oh, sorry, that's the earthworks provision that's been shipped to.
Yeah, but the rule itself doesn't make reference to the standards.
The relevant earthworks standards is your. Probably need to check that with Tina.
yeah, we might just need to check that with Tina this
so
evening.
either something's
Yeah.
missing from the left-hand column, or those words come out of the
Yeah,
right-hand
I see what you mean. Yeah.
Okay. Now, Rule 6 on page 8, which is a new rule you're recommending, talks about construction of new buildings, is what I've highlighted here, as well as conversion, but new ones, activity status restricted, discretionary, matters of discretion, the flood effect from 0.5 AEP event for non-sensitive activities. I have a funny feeling the words non-sensitive activities are in the wrong place.
Is that Rule 6 that you're referring to?
Yes, the new Rule 6, page 8.
And which standard?
No, so the matter of discretion at the bottom of page 8.
Matter of discretion. So that would be 3.
No, number 1. Matters of discretion, number 1.
Oh, the flood
Very
effect
last
from a
one.
0.5 AEP event for non-sensitive activities.
Yes.
So that is a recommended or a requested change by Alliance within their evidence. And that is to remove the assessment of a 0.5% from non-sensitive activities, given that the finished floor level has been sought to be removed from that.
Okay, but the rule applies to buildings, not the use.
Yeah.
So I would have thought it doesn't matter what the building is, you should have a series of assessment matters. The use is different.
So what you're suggesting is removing for non-sensitive activities so that the effect of a 0.5% AEP is considered irrespective.
Well, I don't think the exemption you're putting in there is the right place for it.
Do you think it should live somewhere else?
Yeah, but I'm not sure where, so I'm just flagging.
Okay.
I had enough time to think about it shouldn't be there, but not where it could go.
Okay. Yeah, point
Well,
taken, I'll mark that down.
Yeah, because when you look at how it's trying to work with 1A and 1B, there's no consideration for those sensitive activities aside from evacuation during a 0.5 event.
Yeah, that would be the primary concern, yeah.
And also,
And displacement.
yeah, I'm wondering about, because of what we've heard today from the ES evidence around breach in a 2% event and overtopping in a 1% event, that those also correspond with a likely need for evacuations. So that's something worth thinking about, I think.
So I guess what it points to is the intent of the rule was to deal with the non-sensitive activities in a different way to sensitive. And it may well be that the easiest way to do it is in 2 separate rules. The next one I want to turn to is the new rule, Rule 8, activities in the Mataura River floodway. And my first question is, how many buildings, structures are currently within the floodway? And the floodway is the area that's bounded by the stop banks as it goes through the urban area. And for someone who actually goes fishing along those parts of the river, I think the answer is 0. Now, if the if the answer's 0, then sensitive activities do take place in the floodway on a temporary nature in terms of public events and other events. And I'm just wondering if the intent of that rule is only to refer to avoiding buildings, and following the discussion this morning, floatables as well. So your response was that bylaw of Environment Southland picks up the floatables, and this rule only deals with buildings, is my understanding. And arising from that as well, what is the effect of the exception that you've got underneath? Does that make critical infrastructure a permitted activity?
So could I just clarify, so are you suggesting that this rule was created thinking that if there are new buildings, that they can't be converted for sensitive activities, and that would design this rule around, but given that there aren't any existing buildings, that including the sensitive activities line becomes redundant? Is that?
Yeah, it becomes redundant. So the rule, it's non-compliant to put a structure there, except that under the NES, certain things are allowed anyway.
Yeah, I guess would just want to be clear, because I think from memory, you know, Urupas, for instance, you wouldn't maybe consider that a building or a structure, but it would be a sensitive activity. I need to check the definition, but I think, you know, would just want to make sure that there weren't any unintended consequences for removing that, and then it's a do whatever you want.
It's,
well,
I mean, the amendment to that is based on a submission, which didn't seek any other changes. So that was the root of it, I suppose, in terms of that amendment.
Yeah.
So sensitive
moving
activities
away
was
from the
always
strict
in there.
interpretation of the submission is highlighting that there's a problem with the rule. And
Well,
they've suggested
that was
one way to
focused on critical infrastructure.
Yeah,
That
and they've
submission.
suggested one way, so maybe.
Yeah.
Okay. Why? So what is critical infrastructure, and how does it differ from infrastructure?
It's defined in the plan.
Yeah, there's a definition in the plan. I can read it out once I find it. Maybe move on to the next one while I'm doing it.
So what you're telling me is everything that's in the definition of critical infrastructure is a permitted activity in the floodway.
As far as that rule goes, there's other rules that manage critical infrastructure.
Yeah, there's rules within the infrastructure chapter that deal with that.
So where is the rule that says that that manages them within the floodway?
That would be Infrastructure Rule 9.
Right, okay.
So that submission is from Transpower, and it's been assessed within the Section 42 report.
The addition of P9 as well, NHP9.
Yeah, Section 694 of the 42A report. Speaks to Rule 6.
Of the 42A report, yeah. Yeah. Yes, there is. No, the discussion at the front. So what page is that on? So
Section 42A report, the relevant section discussing Rule 8 that we're talking about is on page 82, and it starts at paragraph 380.
But you made reference to 694.
And 694 is also an infrastructure submission. that is from Transpower and deals with the following rule, Rule 6.
Yeah, 691, 2, 3, 4 on page 86. Right.
86.
So while we're talking about critical infrastructure and how it fits in this chapter, because there is this introduction of P9 that's specific to the Mataura floodway and has the exception, except for critical infrastructure, my understanding is that that exception is a limited exception based on functional and operational need, which I think is a point that Mr. Roy has made in his Appendix 1.
Yeah, that's correct. I think there was an acknowledgement in ES's submission regarding critical infrastructure, and sometimes that need, functional or operational, is in higher risk areas.
Right, and so I would expect to see that reflected in the policy is what I'm signalling, i.e. it's not a blanket exception for critical infrastructure, it's a qualified exception. Would you agree?
Yeah. In what way would you qualify it?
Yeah.
Functional or operational need.
Right.
You, like, in other words, you actually have to demonstrate a need to be there.
Within the policies. I have to go to the policy.
Yeah, so I'm just looking at NHP 9.
P9?
In your Appendix A.
Yep.
Yep.
Right, so that's the Alliance requested change to that one.
So, Maria, are you saying that that should read except for critical infrastructure where there's a functional operational need?
Yeah. But there is NHP 6, which is avoid the placement of critical infrastructure in identified and mapped areas subject to natural hazards unless, and there's 3 criteria, and that includes operational need or functional need.
So, at first viewing then, is there a conflict between P6 and P9?
Well, the request from Alliance to deal with that amendment to P9 was due to a potential conflict arisen through earthworks.
Yeah, but I'm just focusing on this chapter. So critical infrastructure comes up in both P6 and P9.
Yes. So the cut and thrust of P9 is for everything except for critical infrastructure, effectively. So what you're suggesting is rather to avoid confusion around exemption, so that P6 still applies.
Okay. So except for critical infrastructure, see P6, avoid subdivision use and development.
Yep. It amounts to a little bit of ducking, diving and weaving through the scope of the submissions to achieve.
I'm just thinking of Joanna Blogs or Joe Blogs, as the case may be, trying to follow what we've got here.
That's the benefits of a refresh, I suppose.
I think and it gets a little bit more complicated, I think, because I did read in the evidence that subdivision for a particular kind of a purpose might be allowed. A boundary adjustment, I think, a subdivision for a boundary. No, did I read something like that?
For infrastructure,
I
think.
No, well, maybe. But this policy is just everything, like avoid subdivision use and development, and then you've just got this one exemption. But we've also talked about the fact that it's not all uses either, and we do know that avoid is avoid, unless, and so I guess we need to just be a little bit careful with this policy. We understand what it's trying to achieve.
Is it a, yeah, I don't want to recommend a note to that policy.
Agreed.
think the RPS is where that comes in. I think NH.5. Yeah, so it says the policy NH.5 also directs that new subdivision development and placement of critical infrastructure in areas at significant risk from natural hazards are avoided unless, and C of that unless, is subdivision is solely for the purpose of a boundary adjustment.
And then maybe it's safest to reflect the RPS in that regard when we use the avoid in this Mataura floodway.
Now it's turning into a bit of a snakes and ladders day. And the reason for that is that I have a feeling that Federated Farmers is about to come online, and if we're waiting for the maps to turn up, maybe we do deal with them. Sorry, Marcus, we're kind of to and from, but I think the issue that we're wanting to work through with you is probably one of the more critical issues to us as well as to you. And if it takes a bit more time to get it right, so be it. Yeah. So do we have Fed Farmers online? We do. So I can see Rachel there. Good afternoon, Rachel. Are you a team of one today?
Hi there, yes, it's just me today.
Okay, so you've put in your written submissions, and if you just hold on a moment, we'll just grab our copies. So in your hands, we have read through your statement. We see a number of times at the beginning of the statement on pages 2 and 3 that a lot that has been agreed to. So if you just focus on the points where there is still disagreement. We have heard this morning from the recommending planner that the minimum setback requirement of 20 metres, following technical advice that he hadn't picked up on, happy for the setback for accessory buildings to be 10 metres from the residential building. So that was one of the outstanding issues. Was there anything else that was outstanding from your point of view?
There are two further matters which are still outstanding from my perspective. The first being in relation to the area limit proposed for farm tracks. And I think you've probably heard from Stony Creek this morning about the same issues. But from our perspective, farm tracks need to be adaptable to any changes in farm layouts or crop rotations. And if there's no area limit, then the earthworks can be designed to meet the specific needs of the farms, which may be things like wider tracks or additional access points or future expansions. The flexibility allows farmers to modify the tracks as required for these different activities, which might include things like moving large equipment or improving access to different parts of the farm. An argument which we've continually made throughout the planning process, and probably most recently at the eco hearing, is that on farm the nature of the activity will naturally limit the scale of the works carried out. So on farm earthworks are not comparable probably to large scale infrastructure projects. And it's not in the interest of farmers to carry out any more work than is necessary. And then the other matter is just in relation to fences, and the same arguments apply in terms of the nature of fencing naturally limiting the scale. Fences, if you think about how it works in practice, it usually involves digging small post holes or minor excavation along relatively narrow strips of land. The impact on the environment, landscape or surrounding infrastructure is normally low, especially when compared to large-scale earthworks for roads or buildings. In previous hearings, we've also raised the importance of fencing for farmers from a land management perspective. So exempting fencing from earthwork standards encourages better stewardship of the land and contributes to sustainable farming and land use practices. Fencing, just like farm tracks, tends to have minimal environmental impact. It's typically necessary for land management and an array of agricultural activities. We see the activity as low risk and can be managed in a way that ensures sustainability without the need for stringent regulation.
So, do the panel have any questions? I'm not part of the panel that's looking at those two issues, so Cliff?
Look, I've got no questions, but it's issues you submitted on all through the process, so I understand where you're coming from.
Thank you.
And I think, yeah, well canvassed through the hearing process, so very familiar with your position and understand, so kia ora.
Thank you, Rachel. That is very clear. Thank you.
Thank you.
The one thing I would note is there has been a discussion, I don't know if you've been following, in your evidence talking about that 20 metres going down to 10 metres. Our understanding is that that's the direction of travel from the advice, and from the Section 42A advice.
Yeah, I said that.
Did you say that already? Oh,
Yeah,
I've just
I caught that
repeated.
this morning as well. Thank
Okay.
you.
Yep.
All right, well, that's fairly straightforward. I think that's probably the quickest presentation we've had from you, but it was really an opportunity today to make sure that the minute that had been issued, the further information that came in had been put on the public floor, as it were, and that the panel had all the necessary feedback it needed to tidy up its decision. So thank you for coming on board. Thank you for that, and we'll let you get on with your day. Cheers.
That's great. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
What I propose is that it is now 2:30. I'd like to take a 15-minute break for clearing the throat, and we'll come back and have a look at those plans when they come back from the copying. So we'll adjourn for 15 minutes.